I've lived in my current house for 5 years, and over the years, my roommates and I have heard voices, footsteps, and other various noises that didn't come from any of us. One night, when I was alone in the house, the cat outside, I heard something flick the spring doorstep in the foyer. And then when I went to my room to pretend as if nothing happened, a pillowcase was tossed off my bed. Cool. A few weeks ago, my mom was visiting from out of town. I worked from home and had a shift that morning. She told me she was going to grab us some coffee from a local coffee shop. About 30 minutes had passed, and I was on a call with a client complaining about our software when my bedroom door opened. My mom popped her head in the room, saw I was on a call, and froze in the doorway. I made a funny face at her to indicate the client was annoying and waved her into the room. She shook her head and stood in the doorway. I shook my head at her, dismissing her polite reservation, and waved her in again. It was morning, and I wanted my damn coffee. Again, she shook her head. Then she withdrew from the room and closed the door behind her. The call lasted another couple of minutes. As soon as I hung up the call, I walked away from my desk and went to my daughter's room, where my mom usually posts up. The room was empty. No problem, I thought to myself. She's probably in the kitchen chatting it up with my roommates. I walked into the kitchen. My roommates were there, but my mom wasn't. I walked outside to see if she went to her car for something. Her car wasn't there. I went back to my roommates and asked if my mom had returned. They shook their heads. I asked my female roommate if she had come into my room a few minutes ago, and she said she was so swamped with work, she didn't have time to leave her desk. My other roommate, a big male, was in the middle of a long call. It wasn't him either. I slowly walked back to my room, very confused. I'm trying to rationalize what I had seen, who I had seen. I get back to the desk in my room, sit down, and stare at my monitor for a moment. My door opens again, and my mom walks into the room and hands me my coffee. I ask her if she had just now returned from the coffee shop, or if she got back a few minutes early and was messing with me. The coffee shop, as it normally is, was super packed, and my mom had just returned to the house. I asked her for the receipt, and the timestamp proved she couldn't have been the one to mess with me. I didn't feel threatened or scared by whatever I saw. I'm still trying to figure out if there's another explanation. After 5 years of hearing things, however, I just don't know. I'd be curious to know if any of you have experienced anything like this, or maybe have an alternative thought as to what I had seen. Just wanted to share this maybe not so little story about my childhood dog. I consider myself a skeptic, but I've always been obsessed with the unexplained. This is one of the very few events in my life I cannot explain. We got our first ever dog many years ago, when I was still a kid living at home. She was a friendly cocker spaniel, but she really loved me for some reason. She would never let me out of her sight, and followed me everywhere she could. All our neighbours knew her well, because she would hang out at their house with me until my mom shouted for us to come home for dinner. Fast forward a couple years, and I was ready to head out on my own and find a job. This involved me moving to a different city and saying goodbye to my parents and my dog. I couldn't help but think how she would be looking for me, and I was wondering why I wasn't coming home. But that's part of life, so as hard as it was, I moved on. A few weeks later, I got the terrible news. She was gone. I didn't even really catch what happened. My mum was too emotional to explain, but I gathered that it was raining heavily and she was hit by a car. I don't think I've been sadder. I hadn't been home since I left, and the thought of not seeing my dog when I got back was almost too much. But life goes on. A few weeks later, I found a place to rent, and my parents came to help me move in. It ended up being a perfect bachelor pad, and me and the boys would go out drinking and crash at my place often. One of the very first nights ended with 4 of us passing out after some heavy partying. That's when it started. I woke up the next morning to a large puddle in the corner of my bedroom. Immediately, I'm upset because it looks like one of my friends had drunkenly peed in my room in the middle of the night. We're arguing about who did it, when I take a sniff to confirm. It's not pee, but it smells like wet dog. Weirded out, but too hungover to really care, We all forgot about it soon enough. Then it happens again. This time, there's no one else around. In fact, I see the wet patch on the carpet after getting home from work. The only thing that makes sense is a leak somewhere, so I investigate as much as I can, but no luck finding the source. Anyway, being young and irresponsible, I ignore it and hope for the best. Then the final time. I decided after my first few weeks alone to fly back home to my parents for the weekend. Bag packed, ready for an early flight, I go to bed. When I wake up, there it is. This time, the wet patch is under my packed bag, with the bag in the centre. Weirdly, the bag itself is perfectly dry, but the carpet underneath is soaked. I double-checked the contents of my bag. Everything looked fine. So I decided to ignore it again and head to the airport before I missed my flight. Next, we pick up again in my hometown. Made it there with no issues. Left my bag in my old room and went on with the day. Finally, it's time for bed, and I go to unpack my bag and get ready for the night. All my clothes are soaking wet. The distinct smell of wet dog again. The bag itself is still dry, and I did check my clothes earlier that morning, right? This makes no sense. Looking back, every other part of the story could be misremembering, misinterpreting, whatever you want to go with. But I'll never forget the wet clothes. The fact I had to throw everything into the washing machine that night and dig out some old kids' clothes to sleep in. I also let my parents know, and they also agreed with the wet dog smell. The next morning, I'm chatting to my mum about this, and naturally, we end up talking about our dog. I explain how this has been happening back at my new home for the past few weeks, and then she tells me her story. Apparently, they've also had strange occurrences. Our dog had a metal food bowl that stayed outside. When she ate out of it, you could always hear it scraping against the ground as she did. After she passed, they said they would be woken up in the middle of the night to the sound of the bowl scraping against the ground. After the first few nights, they figured it must be the stray cats, so they packed the bowl away, only for the sound to continue almost every night still. After that strange weekend, everything stopped. No more wet patches around my apartment, no wet clothes or wet dog smell. Even the strange sounds at my parents' house stopped after that. It's been 12 years since then, and I've never experienced anything similar ever again. I've thought about this incident many times over the years, and I can't find a way to explain it without the paranormal. But there's some clues, I guess. The wet dog smell, and the fact that she died in the rain. The fact that it didn't start immediately after she died, but a few weeks later, and ended after I went home for the first time. I can never say for sure, but I like to think she couldn't rest until she found me and brought me home. It's almost like she hung around after she died, eating out of a bowl, trying to figure out where I was, until my parents came to help me move. Then she found me in this strange new place and was finally able to rest after she came back home with me in my suitcase, knowing I was safe. Background: family of 5, mom, dad, 1 brother, 1 sister and me. A very superstitious Korean-American family trying to make ends meet living in New York City. It all started with a knock on the window, followed by the same routine yelling, "Get away from my window!" That was Miss Shanko, the old lady living on the first floor of a dirty, run-down, roach-infested apartment I called home. She was always yelling at us for making noise, but we were kids and the sun was out, which meant that we were outside enjoying our youth. We couldn't help being noisy. We were kids and we didn't have a lot of money, so playing Marco Polo and Manhunt was our equivalent of playing with a PS1 or N64. There was always something off with Miss Shanko. When we would play outside, she would watch us from a window, but her window was never exposed. She would always just peek through the blinds so only her eyes would peer through. One day, we decided to play a prank on her. We got water balloons and hid under her window. One of my friends would act as the decoy, and when she peeked her eyes through, we threw those water balloons straight at her window. Boy, did that startle her. She screamed and cursed at us, threatening to kill us. But we were kids and she was an old lady. We didn't really care. A month later, she passed away. We were all indifferent about her death because she would always yell at us. We thought we were good riddance. Later on, we found out that Miss Shanko did not have any family and she was alone most of her life, so there was no one to claim her stuff when she passed away. The superintendent, whom we were all close with, asked me and my friends to help him move some stuff out of her apartment. As kids with nothing else to do, we obliged. That was the first mistake we made. As we walked into her apartment, everything was dark. The superintendent thought the fuse was out because none of the light switches were working, but we soon realised she didn't use light bulbs, but she definitely used candles because there were candles everywhere. Her apartment had that old lady smell and another foul stench that smelled like gasoline and rotting meat. The superintendent told me that he was going to get some light from the basement, so it'll be easier for us to see and move her belongings. So we decided to wait outside her apartment because it was super creepy inside. As the super was going to get the light, we heard a loud bang coming from inside the apartment, followed by quiet footsteps. Scared, we hurried outside the apartment so we could wait for the super there. There was no way in hell I was going inside there without an adult. When the super came back, we told him what we heard and he laughed it off. When we got back inside, the super turned on the light and I was amazed at how much of a mess this place was. There were magazines and newspapers everywhere and a lot of books. Old, thick books that you would see in Harry Potter movies. Most of them didn't have any titles on the covers, which was weird. Anyways, fast forward 5 hours later, most of her belongings were cleared besides some furniture that couldn't be moved by 3 8-year-olds and a 50-ish-year-old man. Before we decided it was enough for today, the super wanted to remove the huge rug in the living room of her apartment, and that's when we saw it. There was a huge pentagram engraved, not drawn on, with a marker or paint, but it was perfectly etched on. It was a perfect circle, as if she'd used a giant protractor to get the dimensions perfectly. And in the middle, there was a big star. As kids, we didn't know what it was, but the super did. He was dumbfounded. He told us to go outside and that he didn't need help anymore. Later that night, we all had the same dream. She was knocking on our window, but this time, she wasn't screaming. She was laughing. This is a true story. Nothing else happened after, but we were all freaked out. Now, today I'm glad I moved out from that shitty apartment. But whenever I think of my childhood, I think of this event. This happened back in August of 2017, right before my second deployment. My best friend from high school, Kyle, and his girlfriend Taylor came out to New Mexico to visit my family and I. We decided a camping trip would be nice, but my kids were too young to do the whole tent thing. At the time, my oldest was 3 and my youngest was 18 months. We elected to rent a cabin at a campground in Weed, New Mexico, called Camp of the Tall Pines. We chose the biggest cabin they have. It was a 2-bedroom cabin with a bathroom and living room with a good-sized fireplace. The fireplace has a cast iron door with a locking handle. The day we get there, we noticed there was an old CRT TV with a satellite box hooked up to it. There was no DC cable for the box, so Kyle and I decided to run into the nearby town of Cloudcroft to see if we could find one. Give the kids something to do before they fall asleep and all that. We got back to the cabin a couple of hours later, and my wife asked me what I had come back into the cabin for roughly 30 minutes after I had left. She said she heard me come in like I was looking for something, singing to myself, which I often do, and then left. See, the problem is, I hadn't come back. In fact, I was pulling into Cloudcroft about that time. Things got a little crazy that night after we all went to bed. I'd been working on building a fire in the fireplace that night and had been decidedly unsuccessful. There was a little fire going, but nothing that would keep you warm. I gave up and we all went to bed. I had a fan on me. I'm one of those guys that can't sleep without a fan. My wife was in bed with me when we heard bumping sounds coming from Kyle and Taylor's room. I figured Kyle was having problems getting comfortable. Kyle is about 6'4", and the beds weren't built with tall people in mind. Jess, my wife, got tired of the noise and my fan blowing on her and decided to sleep on the couch in the living room. A couple hours later, I woke up to Jess screaming for me. I walk into the living room and see this roaring fire behind the cast iron door. She tells me that she woke up because she heard the handle rattling. Then the door opened up of its own accord and a massive fireball billowed out of the fireplace. Then the door closed and latched itself as I was walking in. I figured the ghost was just trying to give me a hand, so I went back to bed. The next morning, Kyle ribs me and asks if I had a good night. I asked him what he meant. He told me he heard me bumping against the wall all night and assumed my wife and I were making love. We decided it might be best if we didn't stay another night and left that evening. We bought our dream home 6 years ago. Only built in the mid-80s, so not a home you'd assume would have been through anything super traumatic. A few years in, I started to notice a strange heavy presence on occasion, when I'd walk into the upstairs guest room. Very rarely used. Nothing malicious, but just heavy air. Didn't think much of it. I had a friend that would stay there on occasion, and one day she mentioned to me that something's in there. She had gone to bed one night, and she told me that she had to loudly tell whatever it was to please leave, but she was very vague on what occurred. She only stayed in the downstairs room after that. Try not to think about it because of my husband is gone a lot and I scare easily, so I just leave that door shut. And it's down at the end of the hall where I don't need to go anyways. Random odd things like the downstairs TV soundbar turning on full blast in the middle of the night. My husband mentioned a hall light turning on one night after everyone was asleep, all chalked up to electrical mishaps. Yesterday afternoon, however, I was alone downstairs doing laundry, and I just felt off. I went upstairs and my bedroom TV was on. It had been off all day, and loaded to the Amazon Prime welcome screen. We have 2 remotes, and it takes a few clicks to get there, especially if the TV was off. Couldn't find the remote to turn it off, so I ignored it. Went back downstairs. When I came back up 10 minutes later, the TV was off. Now I'm irritated, so I march into that room, swing open the door, and tell whatever to leave. Back in my room, I started feeling bad for being super rude to whatever, so I apologized out loud and asked if they knew where my remote was. As soon as I said that, I picked a blanket off the floor and the remote came tumbling out. I said thanks and went about my day. I don't know what's in there, but in my neighborhood it's very common for multiple generations to live together. My only theory is that an elderly beloved family member possibly resided in that room once and likes to come back for a visit from time to time. It was late afternoon, and I was probably around 10 at that time. I was on my way home from school football when I realised an odd man was walking around my street. At first, I stopped walking and examined the man for a moment. There was something about him that didn't sit right with me. The way he moved, the way he looked, the way he was looking at things in such definitive detail, I couldn't really put my finger on it. All I knew was that his presence made me feel very uncomfortable. I went and sat behind a car so he couldn't see me, and I waited for a few moments. As he walked onto someone's driveway out of view, I ran back to my house, which was only a few doors down. It didn't take me too long to reach my drive. However, at the moment I stepped into the driveway, I felt like I was being watched. I didn't want to look back. I rushed into my house to tell my mum and my grandparents what I had seen. Of course, they just brushed it off and made an excuse for it not to be some kind of alien-like man. I couldn't be bothered to stand around and try and convince them, so I went up to my room and stared. I stared out of my window for a while, and then there they were. My window looks out onto my driveway, so I could see him clearly. He was tall, maybe 6'5" or so, and extremely skinny. His neck was abnormally long and his shoulders were narrow. He wore a white sports jersey and a pair of baggy jeans. The top of his head was large and veiny. Overall, he was a really weird-looking person. I bolted downstairs with the most intense adrenaline rush I've ever had to tell my family. Out of breath, I stuttered out my words, and they walked on into the living room to take a look for themselves. My mum's face turned pale as she stared into the eyes of the person who was now standing right up against the living room window. So close, in fact, that you could see the condensation from his breath on the glass. He slowly pulled up a notebook from his pocket and started writing. As this happened, everything was quiet and everybody was frozen. It was the eeriest atmosphere I've ever experienced. A few seconds passed, and he finished taking his notes, and he strolled back down the driveway. Still pale, my mum turned to me with an expression of terror and complexion. The only thing we need to do from here was to contact the police, which we did. However, they looked for this man all over the neighbourhood and he couldn't be found. Overall, this experience has probably been one of the most bizarre and terrifying I've ever had. I'm hoping someone could help me to figure out what was actually happened here and who or what this person was. I had a cat. Her name was Marzi, but everyone called her something else. She was the closest to me and my mother, and we had her for a long time, nearly 10 years. Adopted her back when she was 5 in 2011. We learned in December that she had some weight issues and began to manage it as best we could. But after my mother died, she began to grow worse too. I had to put her down in August on her birthday, according to the chip, and she fell asleep in my arms. Ever since then, every now and then at night, something will happen. What she used to do every night as I was getting ready for bed is she would come over, stretch her paw against my blanket, look to me to give a signal or bearing that hop at the foot of my bed and curl up by my feet. Nothing strange about that. But what is strange is how for a few months after that, and even a few months in the new home, we moved in 2020 around April, I feel those same series of motions press against my bed. The feeling of her paw against my side, of something suddenly appearing and pressing its weight against my feet. It does tend to spook me, but I always assume it's nothing and go back to sleep. Body remembering things and whatnot, but something strange happened last night. I couldn't sleep very well, and last night around 2 a.m, I felt those same repetitions in my bed. I rolled over, thought nothing of it, until I felt what felt like something crawling toward me and resting itself beside my head on the pillow. That scared me and made me jump, and a little while later, instead of facing the wall when faced out toward the room, I felt those motions again. I sat up and saw to my very own eyes something depressing the blankets around my feet before it just stopped. Before that, at the old house, my sisters would complain they could still hear the cat darting back and forth outside in the hall, as if chasing mice again. Never had mice, she would sometimes just start chasing something, though that hasn't happened here. What do you guys think? I don't assume it's a ghost, and instead I assume it's due to sleep deprivation and maybe some anxiety, but I can't rule anything out. I was in between moving from an apartment to my new house, but couldn't move in for a few months. My ex-husband kindly offered me a room in his home. This is a fairly new home, split level. In the basement was a bathroom, a small storage room, and 2 bedrooms with a dividing wall. One room was my room, and one room was my son's, who came back for Christmas break from college. So nightly, I could hear creaking upstairs for months. It woke me several times each night, but my ex had dogs and each time I'd race up the stairs to put them in the garage. They were never there. Besides being irritated, I didn't say anything. One night, my son was asleep in the room next to mine, and in the middle of the night, I'm dead asleep. I heard bang, bang, bang on the wall that separated the 2 rooms. It literally sounded like someone had steel-toed boots and was slamming them against the wall. I woke up suddenly, sat up in bed a little foggy, looked around and thought, maybe it was my son just moving stuff around. It took a while, but finally I tried to go back to sleep. Laying there about 15 minutes later, I heard it again, and this time I saw it. It It was so loud the wall was shaking. Bam, 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 bam. I was actually pissed. I had work in the morning and thought that someone was playing a joke on me or something. I opened my door and looked in the bathroom, hallway. Nothing. Then I looked in my son's room. He was sound asleep, sprawled out on his bed, sleeping on his stomach. It was at that point that I started getting a little befuddled. I looked in the storage room and saw nothing, but felt something. Went upstairs, looked around. My ex was upstairs on the 3rd floor with his dogs, all quiet. I was trying to rationalise what this was. Like I said, I had been exposed to hauntings as a child, and this did not feel like that. It wasn't scary. Went back into my room with the lights on and heard nothing else the rest of the night. The next morning, I asked my son, "Did you hear anything last night?" He replied, "You mean the banging on the wall so loud that it almost broke my mirror? How could I not hear it?" I told him I looked in on him and he was sleeping. He told me he was pretending to be asleep because he was scared to death. Then he said, "Mom, if I tell you something, please don't tell anyone else." My son is a 22-year-old, 6'1", 190-pound young man. Yet he was truly scared of the things that have been going on in his room the past 2 years. He says he thinks it's coming from his closet. The storage room is directly behind the closet. He tells me about the time that he hung his coat on the outside of the closet, then went in to take a shower. When he came out, the coat was on the floor right outside of the shower on the mat. He tried to rationalise why that would happen, but realistically, why would someone drop a huge winter coat on the bathroom shower floor mat? Noises, scratches, missing items, nothing that he can really state for certain that he didn't lose or move. But they happen so frequently that he cannot deny that someone else was doing this. He will not sleep in his room without one of the dogs, and frequently the dogs growl at the storage room door. I have 2 older sons as well. That day they stopped by and I told them about the evening's events. They both simultaneously told me, "Well, yeah, it's the ghost in the storage room." I'm like, "What?" They said when their dad first moved in, they went to move some items into the storage area and felt the worst feeling. They said almost like it was preoccupied. They never went back there. Literally, there's nothing stored in the storage room, and now I know why. Then I started to piece things together. All the nights I heard the creaking above where I sleep. This thing has been here a while. From roughly 1998 to 2000, I lived in a house that gave me, my sister, mom and other visitors paranormal experiences we often share to this day. The house had no history that we knew of or learned of. I was 7 when we moved in and going on 9 when we moved out. My sister was 3 years older. My stepdad was often gone for work. The first experience I remember having was shortly after we moved in. It was also the first to have a paranormal experience in the house. When you walked in the house, there was an entryway that opened up to the living room on the left, the staircase to the upstairs immediately on the right, and straight down the walkway took you to a room we called the den. I remember shortly after moving in, I went into the den to find a man just standing in the corner. Unsure who he was, I remember going to my mom in the kitchen and asking her, "Who is the man in the den?" Concerned, as she thought we were the only ones home, she went with me back to the den. Empty, of course. I don't remember the chronological order of events after the initial encounter, but they continued until we moved out. They were so frequent that I and my sister were terrified to be upstairs alone. The only bathtub was upstairs, and I remember we would try to convince each other to sit outside the bathroom while the other bathed, for fear of being upstairs alone. Any time you were alone in the house, the eerie sense of being watched was almost overwhelming. During the time, we had a stepbrother, Shay, who was roughly my age, and he would come over from his mom's every other weekend. We shared a room and had bunk beds, which I slept on the top. One evening, I woke up late and saw the silhouette of a head at the foot of the bed. I remember whispering, "Shay, what are you doing?" This prompted me to draw attention to listening, to which I noticed his regular, rhythmic breathing I'd grown accustomed to hearing from him sleep. So I knew he was under me, asleep, not at the foot of the bed. I covered my head under the blankets and shut my eyes until I fell back asleep. The next morning, my mom shared her experience from that same night. Our stepdad was out of town this particular weekend, so the only people in the house were me, my mom, my stepbrother and my sister. Late the previous night, my mom had been in the den on the computer. She heard us stomping up the steps. Being past our bedtime, she said she immediately came upstairs to check on us, only to find us all sleeping. During the time she was in my sister's room, she heard another round of someone using the staircase. We all confirmed with my mom that morning none of us had been up. I also shared what I saw. Another night, everyone was downstairs. Me, Shay and my sister were all in the den playing Mario Party on the N64. We were hearing regular hard thumping coming from upstairs. We knew the whole family was downstairs. We also had all had enough encounters at this point to know better than to go upstairs. My sister was always a little more bold than me, however, and she convinced my stepbrother to go upstairs with her. When she said she saw was two women fighting in my mom's room, one slamming the other to the ground by a hair. Those are the experiences I remember in explicit detail. Looking back, they almost seem surreal, as I've had nothing even relatively close to that level of supernatural happen since I lived there. Other family friends have told us about seeing who, in our circle, became known as the Black Man. This is the figure I saw in the den, as well as at the foot of my bed. He was most often seen in the den. My mom has stories of her blankets being yanked off her in the middle of the night, as well as feeling pressure on the top of the blanket, like a hand pushing down, only when my stepdad would be out of town. Interestingly, despite living with us the entire time we were there, my stepdad never had any experiences. My mother's brother suffered from schizophrenia, and she cared for him. She says I look exactly like him. My mom has stories like once he had woken her and my dad up at 3 a.m. from her bedroom door, saying there was a screaming turtle in her mattress while he held a knife. But he never hurt anyone ever, and apparently always meant well. He died before I was born, hit by a car out front of the house. Anyway, I have many stories about my uncle's ghost. First, when I was a toddler, when I would cry, the only way to make me stop crying was to put me in my carriage and rock it back and forth. Or once, my mom was in the living room visiting with our neighbour, and I began to cry in my carriage. And after my mom got up to go over to the carriage, I stopped crying, as the carriage slowly rocked by itself while the mobile turned. My neighbour said it scared her so badly, she just sat there staring at it with my mom. Second, when I was little, I was really sneaky and liked to jump out from behind the closet or curtain and spook my little sister or mom. Well, when I was about 8 or 9, I still took the opportunity to spook others when given the chance. One night, me and my mom were sitting in her room watching TV, when my sister, who had left to grab a snack, returned with a puzzled look before asking me how I got back to the room before her. I told her I never left, and my mom confirmed. She says that she saw my feet from under a curtain to our back door and heard me giggling. At first, I thought she was mocking me because I don't giggle. My mom jumped up and ran to the back door to check all of the locks, making sure they were locked. As I went with my sister to see what she was talking about. Third, if you leave the light in the bathroom on, it will sometimes just get turned off. When I was about 12, my mom was in the bathroom and I heard her say, "Ryan, turn those lights back on." My room only being a few feet away, I was confused and got up to find out who Ryan was. After she left the bathroom, she told me that Ryan likes to mess with her and turn off the lights while she's in the restroom. I immediately began my storm of questions as she told me all about Ryan haunting our house. I did not believe her at all, until my experience. When I was about 15, my little sister's appendix had ruptured, and my mom went with her to the hospital, and I go to watch over the house for the week. It was awesome until the first night. My mom slept with the TV on, so it was extremely quiet in the house because I didn't like leaving on lights or anything I wasn't currently using. I heard everything in our tiny house. With every little odd sound, I rationalized it to be my head messing with me. So I decided to take an early shower. I turned on the hot water in the shower and remembered I would need a towel, so I obviously went and got one. I stopped in the bathroom door terrified because I saw a tall and skinny, not abnormally skinny, but skinny, shadow of a man standing in the middle of the room. I don't know how to explain this, but the shadow didn't come from something, but it was like a person standing there, but they were full black and see-through. There wasn't any light on besides the bathroom light, but I hadn't entered the room, so my shadow would have been behind me. I stood there only for a moment before dropping the towel and running to my room, getting some clothes on, and quickly made my way to the front door, stopping at the bathroom, looking in to see nothing there. I turned off the shower and left the house, locking it and running 3 blocks to my friend's house. I didn't tell him that's why I was there. That's just crazy. I asked if I could stay the night, as it was weird in the empty house by myself. His parents understood, as they knew my sister was in the hospital and all that, and I stayed there, only going back into my house for fresh clothes for school. Otherwise I lived with my friend. When I told my mum after she got home, she asked what it looked like, and I was like, what? It was a tall, skinny shadow. Shadows don't have features. And she just said, if it was just a tall, skinny shadow, it was probably just Ryan. I haven't really seen much more of Ryan, other than the bathroom lights turning off while I'm in there with me shouting, turn the lights back on. No response. They only come back on when I politely say, Ryan, please turn the lights back on. My mum was a realtor and has shown a variety of different houses in her time working that job. About 4 years back, she came home from one pale and jittery. I joke that she looks like she's seen a ghost. She just slowly nods. Apparently, she had been taking pictures of the house in order to put them online, and had been standing in the doorway checking through the digital camera. She'd been taking a while and was apparently halfway through, when somebody had impatiently cleared his throat behind her. Now she was the only one at the house, and so practically jumped through the door to get out as soon as she heard it. Standing on the front porch, she realised she'd left the keys behind her, and so had to brave going back in order to retrieve them. She ran in, grabbed the keys and ran out, back to the car and back home. That's where I came in, made the joke, and the story enters an endless loop of retelling and retelling. Now the house is old, apparently pre-Civil War 1800s, so it's entirely possible that the house is haunted. She goes and calls the homeowner after we discussed whether to do it or not. She calls him, waffles for a bit, and then asks him if the house is haunted. Finally, he asks her, which one did you see? Apparently, there's 2 ghosts on the property. The ghost of a doctor who the wife of the homeowner saw bending over her one night to check her temperature when she was sick. The other is the ghost of the grandmother of the family who originally owned the house. She had gone crazy for one reason or another and had been locked up in one of the upstairs rooms, with a hole drilled through the door in order to look in and see her. People apparently have claimed to see her looking down from that room's window. Months pass as the house tries to sell, and finally Mum had an open house one Sunday where over 100 people come by to look at the house. Near the end of the day, somebody approaches her about buying it, and she promises to begin walking them through the process. That was Sunday afternoon. Monday morning, Mum's woken up by a phone call from one of the other realtors telling her to turn on the TV. Sure enough, on the local news, the house is ablaze and quickly burns completely to the ground. Everybody's a little shaken, and several theories are put forward, from racists to the homeless. Me? I'm firmly convinced that the ghosts didn't want to give up their house that easily, and so dealt with it the only way they could. From about 2018 to 2019, I lived in an apartment by the college I was attending. It wasn't an old apartment, wasn't made out of an old house. Nothing about it seemed like it'd be the least bit haunted. I didn't really even notice all that much to make me reach that conclusion. Sure, sometimes I'd smell the same food cooking about the same time some mornings and nights, and sometimes it'd sound like somebody was taking a step in the living room. But I attributed both to the rooms on three sides of me. The steps could be someone above me, and the food could be anybody cooking. I never even contemplated that it was haunted until one day. This was during the 2019 spring semester. I was graduating at the end of the semester, and so the school year was ramping up and stressing me out. I'd taken naps during the day in order to cope with a broken sleep schedule, and would often sleep during the day, laying face down on the bed in order to block out the light. One Monday, I'd taken a nap. Class had either been cancelled or I decided to just skip it that day, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That was until I blinked blearily awake, with the concrete sensation that a hand was stroking my bangs, starting from the roots and running their fingers through to the tips. It felt nice, to be honest, all except the fact that I lived by myself in that apartment. As soon as I woke up enough to connect that something didn't feel right, I remember jumping up and yelling out in surprise, swearing in complete alarm. The sensation immediately went away, and I was left shaken and standing in the bedroom. I collect myself, go get supper, and try to figure out what's happened. Upon doing research, an old cabin used to be in that spot, and before that, during a battle fought there during the Civil War, a tent had been placed somewhere near there for the soldiers and nurses. I spent the next few months trying to figure out who it could have been and wanting to try to experience it again, but it never came again. I have no idea what it was, and never experienced anything else ever again. I just wonder who it was, and why they seemed so interested in my well-being. In a way, it was kind of nice, kind of sweet, and I have this weird desire to at least know who it was, and what happened to them. Is that weird? Feels weird to me. This happened to me when I was about 11 years old. It was the 90s. I've lived my whole life in El Paso, Texas. The culture is rich in folklore and religious beliefs. Many Hispanic families have stories of the paranormal. One legend popular is the legend of the Weeping Woman, aka La Llorona. The legend of La Llorona is Spanish for the Weeping Woman. Has been a part of Hispanic culture in the Southwest since the days of the conquistadors. The tall, thin spirit is said to be blessed with natural beauty and long, flowing black hair. Wearing a white gown, she roams the rivers and creeks, wailing into the night and searching for children to drag, screaming to a watery grave. No one really knows when the legend of La Llorona began, or from where it originated, though the tales vary from source to source. The one common thread is that she is the spirit of a doomed mother who drowned her children, and now spends eternity searching for them in rivers and lakes. One night, it was just like any other night I lived in a trailer with my mum and dad. My youngest brother was staying with my aunt that night. I fell asleep watching Jay Leno as usual, and when I woke up, I was on the sofa in my living room. The time was 4 a.m, which was illuminated from the stove in the kitchen. The television was off, and normally I had a light on, but this time it was pitch black. I woke up, and I heard a horrible screaming that was coming from afar. The screaming was coming from a ditch that was a few feet away from my home. I heard it, and I thought I was hearing things. I asked myself, am I dreaming? Then I started to hear the animals outside howling and whimpering. These animals that I speak of are cats and dogs. As the screaming got closer, the animals continued to cry. The screaming was something I've never experienced before. It sounded like I was in a big hallway and a woman was screaming her guts out down that hallway. Then, in all the screaming, I started to make out words. These words being said by whoever this was at 4 a.m. screaming their guts out shocked me. The woman said, "Oh, my children." In a huge panic, I quickly got up from the sofa and ran to the kitchen, which was right next to where I was asleep. I turned the closest light and looked around. The screaming didn't stop. In fact, the screaming only got louder and closer. I questioned my sanity at that moment. Was I going crazy or hearing things? Then I thought to myself, this is real, and the animals are responding to it in a negative way. So I did what any other 11-year-old boy would do in a moment like this. I ran to my mum and dad's room. I reached for my mum and shook her awake wildly. She woke up slowly, and to my amazement, the screaming faded away as she woke awake. I thought to myself, what the heck is going on? I told my mother, "Mom, do you hear that screaming and crying lady?" My mum was half asleep as she said, "Go back to sleep, it's most likely just your imagination." I told her, "No, this is real. Please listen. Don't you hear her?" My mum quickly just said, "You're dreaming, so go back to sleep. It's going to be okay." By then, the screaming had faded long away, as if whoever was screaming knew that an adult was awake. I was terrified as I returned to the living room and quickly turned on the television as I left most of the lights on as well. I didn't go back to sleep until the sun came up. I couldn't believe what I heard and witnessed. I was treated like a crazy person whenever I told my story. It got so bad that I kept my experience to myself. To this day, I don't care what people think of my experience. I know what I heard. A couple of years later, it happened to me again. This story takes place after the first incident, with the woman known as La Llorona. Not much happened after the first time I heard her. An incident occurred with my aunt about a year after my encounter. According to my aunt, they were sleeping and suddenly there was a horrible sound coming from the ditch located in front of their house. There is a street in between the ditch and the house, but a house and the ditch are really close to one another. It was about 2:30 a.m. when my aunt was awakened by a screaming woman coming from the ditch. She figured maybe somebody was being hurt or attacked. She walked out to the front yard looking towards the ditch and saw there was no woman. My cousin, her daughter, walked out the front as well, asking what was happening. My aunts, of course, had no idea as the screaming grew closer. Then they saw her, a woman in a white dress. The only thing that shook them to the bone was the woman had no feet and was clearly floating. One other feature that threw them off was that this woman had no face. They both just turned after seeing that and ran inside their house. My aunt locked the door and called the police. The police showed up minutes later and took their claim seriously. El Paso PD was soon looking at the area where this woman was seen and heard screaming. The police soon returned and said there was no evidence that a woman was there. They looked at the area where the woman was seen walking, and not even footprints were found. One of the police officers even asked if maybe my aunt was dreaming everything that happened. The next day was when I went over to visit, and I saw my cousin like I've never seen her before. She had black bags under her eyes, and she hadn't slept since the incident. I asked her what happened, and she said she saw what my aunt saw. The screaming woman with no feet and no face. It took her a while to sleep normal again. She never heard or saw La Llorona again, but to this day, she won't deny that she witnessed something that she can't explain. Unlike my cousin, I don't have the look of avoiding La Llorona. It was in the early 2000s when I worked here in El Paso, Texas, at a local supermarket named Big 8. One of the shifts that I worked was from 3 a.m. to 12 p.m. This store was located in the lower valley of El Paso. In the back of the store is a small ditch. One early morning at about 4 a.m., I had the back doors open and I was taking the empty milk crates outside of the back. I was working with two other guys at the time of this incident. One of the guys, named R, thought it would be funny to close the back doors and lock me outside as a joke. When I heard the doors close shut, I knew he was just messing around. I thought to myself, I'll just stay quiet and wait for him to open the doors again. I wasn't going to give in to the joke of trying to scare me. I stood by the door smiling, thinking to myself, he's not going to scare me. I could see R laughing on the other side of the doors. I thought to myself, well, the joke is on him because I'm not scared. About 1 minute later, in the far distance, I heard screaming. I thought to myself, it's the same screaming that I heard when I was 11 years old. The screaming got louder and closer to me. I felt a chill down my spine and felt that I was being watched by some unseen force. I felt a sense of hopelessness. It was a feeling unlike any other. I started pounding on the door. I yelled, "Let me in! There's somebody out here!" I pounded my fist and started kicking the door. "What the fuck? Let me in!" I could hear R laughing on the other side of the door. I started to kick the door harder. The screaming was now coming from right in the back of me. Just then, R opened the door and said, "What the fuck is that?" Just then, I ran inside and locked the warehouse door. R said, "Why was that lady screaming? Did she need help?" I told him that I don't think that was a lady. I told him what had happened to me when I was younger. R told me, "Jay, don't you think maybe you're cursed or she's following you?" I stayed quiet when he told me that. I couldn't work my shift normally after that. It took a few hours to get over what happened. I admit I was scared, and maybe R was right. What if she was following me? There is one more incident that took place right after. In 2015, I started working as a custodian at Cedar Grove Elementary. Behind the school is the border highway. Then the Rio Grande is of course covered by a huge metal fence that separates Mexico from El Paso. I worked the night shift from 2:30 to 11 p.m. One night, I was stuck working with another custodian until midnight. Right when we were about to leave, we did a walk through the school to make sure all the doors were locked on the outside. I worked with another custodian named C. C always told me that he was never believed in ghosts. Up until that night, I can say. We walked to our cars, and just as I was about to leave, I saw C had opened the hood of his car. Then he asked me, "Hey Jay, can you give me a jump? My car battery is dead." I told him yes, of course. Just as I stepped out of my car, a loud screaming came from the Rio Grande. All the animals in the nearby neighborhood started howling and crying. Once again, the screaming resembled a woman screaming her guts out in a hallway as it echoed all over. C looked at me and said, "Oh my God, is that a demon?" I told him, "No, C, that's La Llorona." He looked right at me and said, "No way, she can't be real." Then I said, "I've heard of her before." And C said, "Hurry please and let's get out of here." I gave him a jump, and just then we saw a border patrol jeep speeding towards the screaming woman. Just then I thought to myself, I can record this and share it with the world. I took my phone out, and just as I hit record, the screaming faded away. C and I looked at each other and he said, "What the fuck?" "Sorry, Jay, I'm leaving, before that evil witch comes back to get us." We both left, and the very next day, C was telling everybody at work how he heard the witch crying the night before. That was the last time I encountered her. I don't think it's the last, as I feel that she may choose who or hears or sees her. I have other paranormal stories, as I was part of a group here in El Paso, Texas. We've investigated many historical locations. I also got the chance to investigate with Amy Bruni and other celebrities that have visited El Paso. There are many places in El Paso, Texas that have stories of paranormal activity. History in El Paso has stories from the legendary Pacho Villa and Billy the Kid. But growing up in El Chuco or the 915 has its share of legends and tales. The many famous locations that are known here in El Paso, Texas are Concordia Cemetery, El Paso High, Plaza Theater, and many more. One location not many people know about is Southwestern General Hospital, located near Cotton Road. In 2009, I was interested in the paranormal due to the fact that I had many paranormal experiences growing up. I found a website that held ghost tours of the old Southwestern General Hospital. I was excited and ready to go on a ghost hunt. The group that held the ghost tour was named Ghost, or Ghost Hunters of South Texas. The group was professional, and they used many of the items that paranormal researchers used at the time. Before the tour, they showed us proof that they had been captured while investigating the property. EVPs included a little boy saying, "Play with me, please," and a woman with a southwestern accent responding to questions. The woman is said to be a nurse seen on the fourth floor by security guards. The woman is said to be seen dressed in an old-time nurse attire. After the tour, the group said they were having openings for new members, and the new members would be tested and would be considered in maybe being a part of the new team. I was quick to join and try out. I made the team. The team would have private group ghost hunts, so we had the building to ourselves. The third floor was used as a hospice type of area. The building has 4 floors. The first, second and fourth floor were left abandoned and looked like a scene out of a horror movie. Hospital beds lay in rooms dusty and unused. Many papers and nurse logs lay on the desks and had dates from 1995. I even found a death log that had names and dates. The most active areas were the 4th floor and the 2nd floor. The 4th floor had a baby nursery and many rooms that were once used for families that would welcome new babies. One EVP that was caught in that area was of a baby crying. At the time that the EVP was caught, there were no babies in the building, and it was after 12 midnight when it was caught. Also, on the 4th floor, there was a long hallway with empty patient rooms. In that hallway, shadows were always seen running or moving. The 2nd floor had old surgery rooms with no windows. Video evidence of a man screaming was caught in this area. Also, many shadow figures were seen in this area. When doing research on deaths in the building, it came up that a nurse was crushed to death when a malfunction with the elevator happened years ago. During the time I was a part of this group, we investigated this building many times. I also led ghost tours in the building with other members. I witnessed shadows, disembodied voices, screams, and one time heard a female humming a song, only to find that the room empty and dark. Videos of doors opening on their own with no wind or people in the building. Also, the 3rd floor had employees that would see things and hear things. Patients also complained of a kid running in their room or a man standing over their bed just looking at them, only to disappear. Over the years, I gained experience and loved what I did. As a group, we investigated many places such as schools, homes, and cemeteries in El Paso. We also got to investigate the old Arsarco smelter before it was demolished several years later. I got to ghost hunt with people from Ghost Hunters and Ghost Hunters International. I met many celebrities, and the group had them take their own personal ghost tours. It was fun, and I grew a thick skin for being scared of anything that goes bump in the dark. One of my favourite places to investigate was Southwestern General Hospital. I never believed in being followed home. One night, after investigating, I was at my apartment eating on my couch and watching TV. I had my hallway light on near the front door that was visible from where I was sitting. All of a sudden, from the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow of a person on the wall near the door. I turned and saw the shadow in full form. It was about 6 foot tall and all black. Then 1 second later, the shadow moved as if running down my hallway to my bedroom. I froze in horror, thinking somebody was in my apartment. I got up and walked to my bedroom. Nobody was there. I searched the whole house. Then I thought to myself, maybe I'm going crazy. I soon went to bed a few minutes later. It was about 3:20 a.m. when I felt my bed shake. I woke up to my sheets being pulled off me very slowly. I tried to move and I couldn't. My sheets slid very slowly off me towards the floor. I couldn't move and I started to hear growling in my right ear. From the corner of my eye, I could see something moving near my head on the right of me. It was on my pillow. I could only see it from the peripheral vision that it had hair. It was hairy and brown. If I can compare it to something, I would say Chewbacca from Star Wars type hair. It was moving and the growling continued. I tried to move my arm and could only move my fingers. My eyes started to water up with tears. The blanket was still being pulled off me little by little until it hit the floor and I was no longer covered by my sheet. I felt the hairy thing moving next to me, and the growling grew louder. Then all of a sudden, I was able to sit up. I turned and looked to see what was next to me. The hairy thing was gone, but I could see the imprint of where it sat on the pillow next to me. It was the size of a full-grown cat. Then I looked around the room to gather my sanity. My sheet was on the floor, and my eyes were still watery. I asked myself, was that sleep paralysis? I found it hard to sleep that night due to the fact that I lived alone in that apartment. The next day, I had a girl over to my apartment that I was seeing from school. I was playing PlayStation and she asked if she could take a nap in my bed. I said yes. She went to my bed and fell asleep. 20 minutes later, she came back to my living room crying. She said, "I have to leave now." I asked her what had happened, and what she said shocked me. She said something that shook the bed and woke her up. She couldn't move, and that's when the growling started in her ear. Then the bed went down as if somebody was lying down next to her. She tried to scream for me and couldn't. Then she felt as if somebody was breathing on her neck as the growling grew louder. She said it lasted about 2 minutes and she was finally able to move. Once she was able to move, she ran to me in the living room. After she explained what happened, she grabbed her stuff and left out my door. I didn't tell her what had happened to me the night before, but for the same thing to happen to her was enough proof that something wasn't right. I couldn't explain what was happening. First thing that came to mind was that something followed me home. After a few days, all the activity stopped. Only when I would go on investigations, I would see shadows in my apartment and then it would just go away. I loved what I did, and the only time I feared the paranormal is this moment. I no longer ghost hunt, and the group no longer gets together. Southwest General Hospital was purchased and is now remodeled and is in use. I can only imagine what the employees of LTAC go through by being in that building. Every now and then, I drive down Cotton Road and past the building. I miss the days of being a part ghost hunter El Paso. If you're ever in El Paso after stopping at Chico's Tacos, be sure and pass by the old building by the Star on the Mountain, formerly known as the Southwest General Hospital.